Horror is an ancient emotion. Long before it was filmed, it was felt. In the rustling of trees, the flicker of candlelight, or the shadow at the end of a hallway. When cinema was born in the late 1800s, it didn't take long for filmmakers to explore fear. But it was the 1920s, the golden decade of silent film, that gave horror its first real shape and scream. These weren't cheap scares or gimmicks. These were carefully crafted, artistic, disturbing tales, made without sound, yet louder in meaning than most modern horror could ever be. This is the decade where fear learned to walk, and cinema learned to make us look over our shoulders. 1. Nosferatu, 1922. A figure rises stiffly from a coffin. Eyes wide, fingers like daggers, head bald as bone. This was Count Orlok. A creature so terrifying, he didn't just play a vampire, he became one in the public imagination. Nosferatu was never meant to exist. It was an illegal adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, changed just enough to avoid a lawsuit, but not enough to survive one. The court ordered all copies destroyed, but like the creature itself, it refused to die. One print survived, and that was all it needed to haunt the next 100 years of horror. Max Schreck's performance wasn't just disturbing, it was unnatural, so convincing that rumors spread. Was he even acting? Nosferatu remains the blueprint of cinematic vampires, and no vampire since has ever truly escaped its shadow. 2. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920. Imagine a world where nothing makes sense, where buildings lean sideways, streets twist like nightmares, and faces hide more than they reveal. That's the world of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a psychological horror told entirely through distortion. The film tells the story of a sinister doctor who uses a sleepwalking man, Cesare, to commit murders. But nothing is quite what it seems. As the film unfolds, it forces you to question: who is insane? Who is in control? And can you trust what you're seeing? Its sets were painted like hallucinations. Its shadows had lives of their own. And its ending, a mind-bending twist, was decades ahead of its time. More than just a horror film, Caligari was a mirror held up to a world still reeling from World War I. A world where trauma, fear, and madness were not just on the screen, but in the streets. 3. Häxan. There's horror, and then there's unholy horror. Häxan dared to blur the line between history and hell. It was part documentary, part reenactment, part fever dream. A film that chronicled the history of witchcraft through shocking imagery. We see demons dancing, witches flying, women being tortured, and devils grinning. It was graphic, bold, and years ahead of its time. But beneath the horror lay a message: that most of history's witch hunts were fueled not by evil, but by ignorance, by fear, by the refusal to understand. Director Benjamin Christensen didn't just want to scare you. He wanted to show you that horror isn't always fictional. Sometimes it wears robes. Sometimes it passes judgment. And sometimes it's us. 4. The Phantom of the Opera, 1925. A beautiful opera house, a rising star, and beneath it all, in the dark, damp catacombs, a figure watches and waits. Lon Chaney's Phantom isn't just a monster. He's a man, broken, disfigured, and desperate for love. But that desperation turns deadly. When the Phantom's mask comes off, it reveals not just a horrific face, but a soul consumed by obsession and loneliness. Audiences in 1925 weren't ready for what they saw. Some screamed, others fainted. Chaney's makeup was so shocking and so secretive that no one knew how he achieved the look. But that wasn't his only power. He made us feel sorry for the monster. He reminded us that horror isn't always evil. Sometimes it's tragic. 5. Faust, 1926. One man, one wish, and the price? His soul. Faust was the most visually ambitious horror of the silent era. Directed by F.W. Murnau, it adapted the ancient legend of a scholar who makes a deal with the devil. What followed was a ballet of light and shadow, storms sweeping across villages, demons towering over cities, and a descent into darkness both physical and spiritual. Emil Jannings as Mephisto, the devil, was playful, cunning, and utterly captivating. He offered youth and love, but always at a cost. Faust didn't just tell a horror story. It asked a question we still ask today. What would you give up for everything you've ever wanted? 6. London After Midnight, 1927. There are lost treasures in film history, and then there's London After Midnight. Starring Lon Chaney again, this time as a top-hatted vampire with sharp teeth and ghostly eyes. The film was described as terrifying by those who saw it, but today no full copy survives. A tragic vault fire in 1967 erased it forever. What's left? A few still photos, and a myth that grows every year, because sometimes what we can't see scares us more than what we can. 7. The Golem, 1920. Long before Hollywood made Frankenstein, European cinema told the story of another creature brought to life. The Golem is based on Jewish legend. A rabbi, fearing the persecution of his people, creates a being from clay, a protector, strong and silent. But once created, the Golem becomes hard to control, and what was meant to be salvation slowly becomes something else. The film, made in Germany during a time of rising anti-Semitism, carried deep symbolism. It asked, what happens when we create power without understanding it? And what responsibility do we hold when that creation turns on us? The Golem's empty eyes, towering frame, and tragic silence made him a horror icon. Not because he was evil, but because he was misunderstood. Silent films didn't have screams, but they didn't need them. Their terror was visual, psychological. It got under your skin and stayed there. The 1920s laid the foundation for every horror film that came after, from slashers to thrillers, from psychological horrors to monster movies. But what makes these films timeless is that they still make us think. They remind us that real fear doesn't always come from sound. Sometimes it comes from silence, from shadows, from the unknown. And from the very first moment that fear was filmed, it never left the screen again.